Welcome to a guide to every deck in EDH, and we are looking at Dina Soul Steeper. So Dina Soul Steeper is a Golgari 2-mana commander. It's a 1/3, and it says whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. And it has tap, sack another creature. It gets +X+0 until end of turn, where X is the sacrifice creature's power. For the most part, we are not interested in the second ability. We are mostly interested in the first ability. So one thing to note is that it's whenever you gain life, regardless of how much life you gain, each opponent loses 1 life. So instead of gaining a whole bunch of life, what you want to do is gain very little life over and over and over. So we're primarily going to be looking for cards that gain us usually just 1 life at a time, but that trigger constantly based on some easy to acquire game state. So obviously there's a lot of things to cover as usual in these types of decks. So before getting to combos and all the synergy cards, well, of course, the typical card draw spells, although in this case we've added Well of Lost Dreams, which is a 4-mana artifact that says whenever you gain life, you may pay X, where X is less than or equal to the amount of life you gained, and if you do, you draw X cards. So every time we gain life, we can pay X and draw X cards, which is going to be good in this deck. A little bit of fast mana to get going, typical Golgari lands. The Forbidden Orchard actually does have a use in this deck, which we'll get to later. Then we've got all the life gain cards, which again, we're going to skip for now. We need a little bit of protection to make sure that we're not getting disrupted during our combos and synergies turns. So we've got Veil of Summer and Dosen the Falling Leaf. Players can only play spells during their own turns. You could add more protection like City of Solitude, but I think this is enough. Of course, we've got a whole bunch of ramp, a little bit of removal, some stacks cards. We're mostly not using artifact-based ramp, so we can afford to run Collect Roof and Null Rod, and then a little bit of other stacks cards over here, including Winter Orb, for the same reasons as Null Rod and Collect Roof. We've just got a lot of mana dorks and a lot of things that fetch up additional lands. And then our tutors, of course, including crop rotation, because we're going to use Gaia's Cradle. So we then want the things that gain us life in increments in order to trigger Dina. So we've got Bloodchief Ascension, 1 mana enchantment at the beginning of each end step. If an opponent lost 2 or more life this turn, you may put a quest counter on it, and whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, if Bloodchief Ascension has 3 or more quest counters on it, you may have that player lose 2 life. If you do, you gain 2 life. So this is going to be involved in various combos that we'll get to in a bit. Demon's Horn, whenever a player casts a black spell, you may gain 1. So this, of course, triggers off of you casting any of your own black spells, although you don't actually have that many black spells in the deck. It's mostly green spells, but it also triggers on opponents casting their own black spells. We've got Druid Class. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. It has some additional level up modes, but the first mode is really the one that we care about. Essence Warden. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you gain 1. Golem's Heart. Whenever a player casts an artifact, you gain 1. Jaughty Offshoot, same deal as Druid Class. Landfall, you gain 1. And then Kazandu Nectar Pot, same deal. Whenever land enters under your control, you gain 1. Kraken's Eye is whenever a player casts a blue spell, you gain 1. Now, obviously, you don't have any of your own blue spells, but, you know, this is EDH. There should be at least 1 blue player in your pod. Then we've got Life Gift. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, period, under any player's control, you gain 1. Power Leech is... this is wordy, and it is based on the old templating. So basically, it's just whenever an opponent activates an artifact, you gain 1. Any artifact activation, so all mana rocks, is you gain 1. Prism Ring, choose a color. Whenever you cast a spell of the chosen color, you gain 1. So you choose a color, and then it's only 1 mana. So it's cheaper than a card like Demon's Horn over here, but it's only your own spells that you cast. It doesn't include all players. Prosperous Innkeeper, this is ETB, make a treasure, and then whenever another creature enters under your control, you gain 1. So instead of Essence Warden triggering on every creature entering, it's only your own creatures, but you do get a treasure token. Retreat to Hagra, landfall, each opponent loses 1 and you gain 1. Roots of Life, you choose islands or swamps as it enters, and then whenever a land of the chosen type an opponent controls becomes tapped, you gain 1. So islands or swamps, whichever one is more prevalent in your pod, whenever an opponent taps one of their islands or swamps, you gain a life. Then, of course, Sheoldred, because it is gaining life off of us drawing cards. We've got Spectrum Sentinel. It is a 1 mana 1/2 with pro multicolor, but the more important part of it is whenever a non-basic land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you gain 1. And since most players play mostly non-basic lands nowadays, that is pretty much going to be whenever an opponent plays a land, you gain 1. Thought Leech, whenever an island an opponent controls becomes tapped, you gain 1. So similar to Roots of Life, except it is always islands. You cannot choose swamps, and it's 1 cheaper. And then finally, Worm's Tooth, whenever a player casts a green spell, you gain 1. So the idea is to use all of these various life gain spells in combination with Dina, so that every time you are gaining a life off of all of these small things happening, your opponent is also losing, all of your opponents are also losing a life. And then we've got our combos. So of course, any deck that runs Bolas' Citadel can run Sensei's Divining Top to put it back on top and cast it for a single life. And then you can, of course, have Aetherflux Reservoir to combo with that. And then Aetherflux Reservoir is also going to be good in our massive life gain deck in order to gain more life and trigger Dina and to eventually just get up to 50 and Death Star Laser our opponent. We may sometimes be able to actually get up to the amount of life that we need even outside of Bolas' Citadel. Then we've got the Bloodchief Ascension, which is going to not only trigger on opponents having cards go anywhere, so they lose 2 and we gain 2, but since we gain 2, it triggers Dina, which is basically going to be that whenever an opponent has a card go into the graveyard from anywhere, they lose 3 life in combination with Dina. We've got the Wither Chain combo in Witherbloom Apprentice plus Chain of Smog. We've got Marauding Blight Priest as basically a second copy of Dina. Whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. So this can either be rather than Dina if your opponent countered or killed it, or in addition to Dina to be draining 2 life per life gain. And then of course, Exquisite Blood. Whenever an opponent loses life, you gain that much life. So this auto combos with both our Commander and Marauding Blight Priest, so that the moment any player loses a life or we gain a life for any reason, that these both trigger, or Exquisite Blood plus Dina both trigger, chain reacting back and forth to drain our opponent out. And then in order to combo with Essence Warden and Prosperous Innkeeper, we have Ashnod's Altar plus Trudge Garden. So Trudge Garden is a 3-mana green enchantment, and it says whenever you gain life, you may pay 2. If you do, you create a 4/4 green fungus beast creature token with trample. So as long as we have this Ashnod's Altar and then either Prosperous Innkeeper or Essence Warden, what'll happen is that we either gain life for any reason, or we just have a creature enter the battlefield to gain life. That triggers the Trudge Garden. We then sack a creature to Ashnod's Altar to pay for Trudge Garden, and we make a 4/4 token. The 4/4 token entering the battlefield triggers either Essence Warden or Prosperous Innkeeper, whichever one that we have out, gaining us life, triggering the Trudge Garden again. We can then sack the Beast token that we just made in order to produce the 2 mana that we need in order to pay for this trigger again. So using this, we infinitely gain life, and then as long as we have Dina out or Marauding Blight Priest, we then also infinitely drain our opponent out. So it is a 4-card combo. We do need our Commander plus Ashnod's plus either Essence Warden or Innkeeper plus Trudge Garden, but that is another combo that we can do. So the main deal with this deck is it's going to be 2 different strategies. Either we're going to want to assemble one of these combos, or we're just going to want to assemble a bunch of the life gain spells and then slowly attrition away our opponent's life totals as we continuously gain life from multiple of these effects, especially ones that have lots of triggers based on small incremental things happening like Essence Warden, Worm's Tooth, etc., and eventually just drain our opponents out. And Forbidden Orchard in this deck is specifically relevant because a creature entering the battlefield can trigger Essence Warden. And that's really the only reason that Forbidden Orchard is in here. And then, yep, that is Dina Soul Steeper.